Thank you for taking our questions. Minister Gould, could you just be a bit more specific? So what are you asking from these social media companies that you are meeting with now? What do you need to see from them to make sure that Canada's democratic process and electorate's decisions are not compromised?
So as I said, the first thing that I've asked for is for activities and actions that have already taken place in other jurisdictions to be applied here in Canada as well. Such as, for example, Twitter has their ad transparency center to apply that here in Canada. That is a good example of one of the things that we're asking for. And we are constantly monitoring what they're doing. The EU has made some requests ahead of the EU elections, and we'll be following that and seeing if that should be applied in Canada as well. And importantly, it really rests on those three pillars in terms of the integrity, authenticity, and transparency of the activities that take place on their platforms. Quite frankly, we see that the social media companies, while they're starting to take some responsibility, still have a ways to go. And I think for their consumers and their users, they want to know that when they're interacting on those platforms, that they can have confidence in the interactions that they're having. And it's not a stretch to say that parliamentarians here in Canada, but also around the world, are looking closely at the activities and the responses of social media platforms to how they respond with regards to our democracy in terms of how we move forward.
The government has said repeatedly on occasion that there have in fact been attempts at foreign interference in the Canadian democratic process. Mr. Trudeau repeated that again today. And yet you have so far refused to tell us what those attempts have been. Are we to conclude from that those were not serious enough to warrant alerting the public?
Yes.
So, very low level?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I just ask you about domestic actors? You've been stressing foreign actors through this whole press conference, and yet your officials say this is meant to apply to domestic actors as well, and some would suggest that that's probably more likely in Canada, that you're going to have malicious actors trying to influence the outcome or just be disruptive. Where do you draw a line between sort of normal political activity during a campaign in which there's a good deal of misinformation being spun around versus something that's more orchestrated and malign?
Absolutely. I think that's a really important question, and it's this space is notoriously tricky with that regard. With regards to foreign interference, it's a bit more clear-cut. One could argue that, ensuring that our elections are free from foreign interference, and that is the basis of what this announcement is today. However, there were other changes made to the Canada Elections Act in C-76 that would strengthen the investigative powers, but also the ability to apply the law through both Elections Canada and the Commissioner of Canada Elections. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, there have been new additions with regards to the malicious use of a computer. Hacking internally is still an illegal event, and that would be monitored and enforced by the existing authorities that we have here in Canada. Also, with regards to the spread of false information, we clarified the legislation to ensure that it would be the Commissioner would be able to apply it based on the recommendations that we received from both Elections Canada and the Commissioner in the CEO's report following the last election. Also, with all-party support, we tightened the restrictions with regards to foreign funding in our political system writ large. And so there are a number of mechanisms in C-76 that will ensure the integrity of the system domestically that are very important to highlight as well. And, as the CSE report noted, cyber attacks obviously we're focused on foreign attempts, but this could also be the result of criminal activity or, so-called hacktivist groups. And if they are in contravention of the Elections Act, we have the tools and resources to be able to to go after them through Elections Canada and the Commissioner, but that resides in their domain.
Okay. Tom Korski, Blacklocks.
Minister Gould, you're aware the Elections Act has had a fake news sanction for 17 years, and yet your government last year took this a step further. It arranged a contract with a third party through the Department of Canadian Heritage called the Public Policy Forum that, with subsidies, proposed to, in its words, expose in real time disinformation in digital media. No follow-up, but 2 questions for you now. What assurance can you give, because we can't get any records on this from Privy Council Office, the Department of Heritage, or the Department of Justice, what assurance can you give that no federal agency or any freelancer paid by a federal agency will supervise, monitor, or interfere in election coverage or comment? And what is the bright red line between investigating Russian bots and going after coverage or commentary or chat rooms or websites or YouTube channels that say things that you don't like?
So what is really important to note is that in no way whatsoever does this announcement limit Canadians' freedom of expression or free speech. What we're talking about today is foreign interference activities that try to manipulate the conversation. What we saw and what we have seen around the world is incidents where what looks like legitimate domestic actors are actually masquerading. It's actually foreign actors masquerading as domestic actors. That's not always easy to detect, and it's done specifically not to be easy to detect. As my colleague mentioned, these are, covert operations to try and manipulate Canadians. What we are trying to do is, if that information is available to us as a government or to the media, to ensure Canadians have the tools to make informed choices. With regards to civic education and civic awareness, there are a multitude of very capable organizations in Canada who will be able to provide guidance to Canadians on how to evaluate information that is coming at them. Ultimately, it's not our job to tell Canadians what is good or bad information, but to provide them the tools and the resources to, when something comes at them, to make a choice on their own and to say where this information is coming from, who is behind it, and what their objective is. With regards to the money that I announced today, the funding that was announced today, the objective is to have civil society organizations in Canada who can help provide some of the civic awareness and education to evaluate news, digital media, etc., the information coming to Canadians so that they can make their informed choice of how they ingest this information and how they share it or not.
So I just want to be sure I grasp this. You can't constitutionally affect a free press or free speech. You're telling me that you're going to pay some organization, presumably the Policy Forum, to rate the accuracy of digital media in an election year, and no one finds that creepy.
I'm actually not telling you that. What I'm saying is that we are providing funding for civic education and awareness to help with media and digital literacy. When you open up a newspaper, you have a sense that this is coming from a journalist who's professional, who has done their research, who's worked at it, and whose information is coming from a reliable source. Of course, depending on which newspaper that is, you have a sense of where that information is coming from. When you go onto a social media platform and you see a meme or you see a story, if it's being shared by a friend or a cousin or someone trusted, you may implicitly share that information because it's coming from a trusted source. What we think is important, and what Canadians, I believe, think is important, is to understand where that information is coming from and to have at their disposal the tools and information to be able to assess that information critically, to assess its validity, to assess the source, and then to make their own decision about how they use that information. That's what I think is important.
Mr. Gould, you touched on this, so I think perhaps you anticipated the question being raised either by some parties or by reporters. You mentioned that this isn't about refereeing the next election, but how do you anticipate or how can you envision a balance between denouncing disinformation and what some would call political spin, where quite often any of the parties use information that is a little false, very false, to make political gain? How can you explain that balance so that people aren't worried about what this might do?
Of course, an election period is a period of heightened information and heightened discourse that's going on, and it's incredibly important and vital to our democracy to ensure that the space for legitimate domestic discourse takes place. That's where the protocol would only be enacted at a very high threshold if there is evidence that foreign interference is at a moment where a free and fair election could be called into question. That's why we have engaged with the political parties. We've met half a dozen times so far and will continue to do so. It's why political parties' leaders will have, and their officials of their choosing will have, security clearance to ensure that we're building confidence into the process. They will be alerted before a public announcement. But also importantly is that they also have a direct line to CSE should they want to seek advice or should they raise something on their own. The important part is that we're announcing this today to continue to build confidence and trust into the process so that hopefully if something arises, all implicated stakeholders will have trust in the process.
But with all due respect, your officials, or the officials during the briefing recognized that it could be domestic disinformation. So it's not just foreign actors. And where is the line between a domestic actor doing misinformation for political gain and a domestic actor doing disinformation? You mentioned interfering with the election. Well, memes denouncing some politicians or capsules saying certain things about immigrants can affect an election because it can sway someone's opinion. So where is the line, and what do you say to people who worry that you're policing some information and not others?
So legitimate domestic discourse is, of course, something to be encouraged. And I appreciate that during an election and during a writ period, this is heightened. When it comes to doing things lawfully, that is, of course, to be encouraged. If there is a coordinated attempt to undermine the system breaking the Canada Elections Act, that is something that Elections Canada, the Commissioner of Canada Elections, and the RCMP would be seized with.
Karina Roman, CBC.
Another Karina.
Yeah, another Karina. Spelled the same way, too. I wanted to get back to the social media for a second. You did say that they have a lot of work to do ahead of them, and I think they're notorious for not really being receptive to change or receptive to governments telling them what they'd like. So I wanted to hear from you in your discussions with them what their response has been so far, not just concretely, but do they seem open to what you're looking for?
I think there's an openness. I think there's an understanding on the part of the social media platforms that they need to do things better, that they have to re-earn the trust of the people that use their platforms, and that over the course of the past couple of years, there have been several incidents that have weakened the trust that people have in their platforms. I would say that, given the fact that in C-76 we legislated